Everybody, thank you very much for coming to this event. So this is the Borton-Moseley annual lecture. It's an annual lecture in honor of Hugh Borton and Philip Moseley, whom I'll describe in a moment. And it is also co-sponsored by the China and the World program in SIPA, which is run by our colleague Tom Christensen. It's jointly organized by the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the Harriman Institute. So Hugh Borton, who is a Japan historian, was one of the founders of what was then the East Asian Institute. He joined Columbia in 1937. He played an important policy role in the State Department and in the occupation of Japan, including a role in preserving the role of the emperor in Japan and in writing the Japanese constitution, and then came back to Columbia and was the second director of the East Asian Institute. And later, at the end of his career, went back to his alma mater at Haverford College, where he served as president. Philip Moseley joined the Columbia faculty in 1940. He also played an important policy role in the State Department during the war and after the war, and then came back to Columbia and set up what was then called the Russian Institute, and served as the director from 1951 to 55, and went back in the policy world at the Council on Foreign Relations as the director of studies, and then back again to Columbia. These two people promoted area studies, promoted the intersection of academic work and policy work, and set up what are the probably two most active institutes, area studies institutes within Columbia, and vindicated in their lives the value of area studies, both for academia and for policy. They also both stood up during the McCarthy years for academic freedom. So the two institutes are still strong. The two institutes are still doing area studies and intersecting with policy and academic studies. And we're very happy to honor them by having this annual lecture. And now we will have Alex.
Hi, everyone. So always sort of double protocol in these jointly organized things, right? Yeah, my name is Alex Cooley. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College. I'm the Harriman rep at this topic. And actually, I am even more delighted than usual to be part of this, because this is a topic that really interests me as well, in terms of like my research evolution and really when Andy talks about the importance of area studies, the enduring importance of area studies, and how area studies is constantly evolving, right? Yes, it informs policy, but it can do so in different ways. And what's even more exciting than that evolution is when these two regions speak to one another. So when we think about Central Asia and Central Asia's location, right, it is so often referred to as someone's backyard. Right. This is Russia's backyard, right? This is sort of, China's frontier land. The kind of endless speculation about, well, will China and Russia actually tolerate one another geopolitically? And lost in so many of these analyses is a kind of discussion not only of the agency, right, that these Central Asian countries themselves understand very well their neighborhood and their backyards, but just, I think, the entire sort of strategic element of how they maneuver, how they create space for themselves, how they leverage their own domestic politics, right, and social movements in what is a really tough neighborhood. So in that spirit, I'm so excited to welcome three really distinguished scholars and observers of the region. First, Bradley Jardine, who is co-author of Backlash, China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia. I'll just point out this book was published last year by Hearst and I think Oxford here in the U.S., right? So both of those imprimaturs. Bradley is managing director of the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs and is a political risk analyst based in D.C., a former fellow at the Wilson Center, and a commentator for many different outlets. He also served as editor of the Moscow Times. So he brings to us years of sort of field work in Central Asia, looking at China in various forms of engagement. Also, absolutely delighted to welcome back Professor Edward Lemon. Ed is the research assistant professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University in Washington, D.C. And he is president for the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs and Bradley's co-author. I'll mention that Ed was previously a Mellon postdoctoral fellow with us at the Harriman Institute when he was just after he had finished his PhD from the University of Exeter. And even then he was making connections, the transnational dimensions of Central Asia. So again, a really experienced field work hand in places like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Poland. And then absolutely delighted to also be joined tonight by Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, who is now a senior research scientist in the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division at CNA. Prior, she was a professor of political science at Montclair State University from 2005 to 2024. But since 2002, she has been a research scholar at Weatherhead. And so it's wonderful to have members of both the Weatherhead and the Harriman communities on this stage to talk about this important topic. And I should mention also Dr. Wishnick speaks Russian and Mandarin and really gives us all sorts of unique perspectives and insights on the region. So the format for today, we will have our co-authors talk to us about this book. And I just want to point out, like, the subtitle of your talk is different than the subtitle of the book. And I don't know if that's intentional. Maybe you can let us know why that is. And I like the inflection there, how Central Asia is reshaping China's rise. So we'll go about 35 minutes. Then we will bring the chairs on the podium, not to spoil the nice screen. Professor Wishnick will kick off the conversation with her discussant remarks, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a discussion on this important topic. So Ed, the floor is yours. Welcome back.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Professor Cooley. Thank you, Professor Nathan, for the generous introduction. So, as Alex just mentioned, the title of the talk is slightly different to the title of the book. Maybe it's a better subtitle than the book offers. It maybe conveys the message that I'm going to give you today and that Bradley's going to give you. That is that, as Alex said, Central Asia is often thought of as pawns on the grand chessboard of geopolitics, neighboring Russia and China. Its importance is often thought about as through its neighbors, such as Afghanistan, such as Iran, Russia, China. But the story we're going to tell, the story we tell in the book, is about how Central Asians themselves, both at the elite and the kind of everyday citizen level, are reshaping China's rise in the region. Here are some photos taken over the past 2 years. They feature the so-called C5, the 5 Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, meeting with various global leaders as groups. We can see the meeting between Donald Trump and the 5 presidents here. The first meeting at the head of state level was actually at UNGA here in New York with President Biden in 2024. First heads of state level meeting between the Central Asians and Japanese leadership, EU, the China plus Central Asia format that was created in 2020, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Russia, and then the 5 Central Asian leaders plus Azerbaijan, who've been meeting on an annual basis since 2018. So at this elite level, Central Asia is trying to insert itself in global politics. But this isn't just an elite level story. So Here is a map of recent attacks that took place on the long 900-mile Tajik-Afghan border. Through a number of attacks in November 2025, 5 Chinese citizens were killed in 2 separate attacks. The motivations for these attacks slightly unclear, conducted by militants. We certainly know there's been tension around China's activities, the mining activities on the border affecting the flow of the Panj River that separates these 2 countries. But they really illustrate how China's growing role through Belt and Road Initiative is coming under threat. And the story of Backlash is really a story of the ways in which Central Asians are pushing back against China's presence and the way in which China is responding to this. And one of the ways in which it's responding, Bradley, you took this photo right back in 2023, I think it was. And this is the secret, not to be never publicly acknowledged, Sitod, which is one of China's first overseas military facilities. It's controlled by the People's Armed Police. It was opened up in about 2016, 2017 as part of an agreement between the governments of China, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And it sits down, you can see on the map at the far right corner near the Wakhan corridor, which separates Pakistan from Tajikistan and was created during the colonial period and creates that very small border between China and Afghanistan at the end. And so one of the responses that China's had to increasing backlash, of course, is its growing security presence. The photo at the bottom is a picture of another Chinese-funded facility in the region. Another photo of the base here, you can see with the mountainous background. And ultimately, in the book, in this talk, we're going to talk about China's dramatic rise in the region. If we think back 20 years ago, trade between China and Central Asia was about $14 billion a year. Now it's over $100 billion, or according to the Chinese side, as of last year, it's pushed above that $100 billion level. If we think of China's role in security in the region, it was minimal. Now it's playing a key role in terms of arms transfers, has military facilities in the region, providing security assistance. So we're interested in mapping the rise of China, particularly in that security and political area, and we're interested in how that's driving backlash against China. And then finally, how China's adapting its response and its role in the region as a result of this. And the quote at the bottom kind of sums up the theme of today's talk, which is that Central Asians are not merely passive recipients of China's influence, but local actors are actively contesting and shaping Beijing's ability to project power, highlighting the limits of its ambitions and complexities it faces elsewhere. But to delve into this, I'm going to hand over to my co-author Bradley to take us through China's rising role and Russia's interest in the region. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. It's kind of unfortunate, everyone's talking about how we should talk about Central Asia as agency. We shouldn't just talk about great powers. But I'm going to talk entirely about great powers, great power perspectives on the region to at least set the stage for thinking about Central Asia, the way that Central Asia fits within international geopolitics. And then we'll learn more in the second half as Ed comes back about how the Central Asian states perceive their role in this so-called great game, however you want to call it, and how do they play it and play different actors up against one another to get advantages. Now, I don't know how informed the audience is on Central Asia. I'll just give a very brief introduction. Of course, in the 19th century, with the expansion of the Russian Empire onto basically regions in Central Asia that were very close to the British Empire at the time in South Asia. The Great Game was basically played out with spycraft. There was ways that the Russians and the Brits would play these regional statelets against one another in order to keep one another at bay. A lot of the borders of today that we've talked about that will become very important, like the Wakhan corridor, which is China's only border with Afghanistan. It's a very small 120-kilometer border with Afghanistan. But it's one that China has invested a lot of infrastructure in to protect. But this border emerged as an agreement between the Russians and the Brits to create a buffer where their empires wouldn't connect. The Brits feared that the Russians would start to annex parts of their empire. So Central Asia was seen for both actors as a buffer region. Now, in the Cold War, of course, Central Asia, it should be noted, is much how we want to define Central Asia's boundaries. We know it today. It's the 5 republics, the post-Soviet republics. Of course, historically, it's a much larger region, including what is today Xinjiang in Western China. which we probably read a lot about the repressive campaign that's taking place inside China, Uyghur crackdowns, and so on. A lot of China's domestic policing, its security goals inside Xinjiang, also have impacts across the border in Central Asia as well. Oh, sorry. Am I too far away from this? Okay. Sorry, I didn't realize. So in the Cold War, just to summarize, with Russia, China had very complex relations. The Chinese had a different interpretation of socialism, their role in the world communist movement, and their ideological rivalry also played out in Central Asia. The Soviets had Radio Tashkent that would beam anti-Chinese propaganda into Xinjiang. They would try to mobilize local minority groups in order to gain influence in the region, or at least undermine China's position. And of course, this kind of history, this history of intervention, is something that continues to color China's perceptions today of its internal security, and why it's really taken such a deep focus on the region across the border in Central Asia for protecting this region called Xinjiang. And then, of course, when we think about modern day, when we think about Central Asia, we're often thinking about the war on terror, the US intervention in Afghanistan. And of course, this had geopolitical ramifications as well, particularly Chinese fears of having the US on its borders, potentially, again, having more role in Xinjiang potentially, or in dividing up China, as Chinese think tanks were putting out at the time. There were lots of concerns, fears about how the region would weaken China. So this kind of capturing China's interests in order to talk more about China's rise in the region is, of course, this buffer zone idea, that in the early 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, China started to grow concerned about the idea of ethnic Uyghurs who lived across the border in Central Asia. There are over 400,000, according to some numbers, residing in Central Asia today, largely in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And there were concerns in the 90s that they would become active political groups pushing for reforms, or pushing for, as China perceives it, separatism within Xinjiang itself. So very early, China started to worry about the emergence of 5 Turkic states across the border from Xinjiang, and about the potential political ramifications internally. Of course, part of this is authoritarian maintenance. China has supported a lot of infrastructure through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a lot of support for authoritarian regimes. It's not necessarily pushing a coherent view of what its model of governance would look like, but it's willing to work with authoritarian leaders. They're much easier to deal with in terms of the goals that China wants, which is silencing space for protests, potential Uyghur-related human rights movements, or even calls for more political engagement. Of course, resource security. China's very interested in Central Asia as a means of diversifying away from dependence on energy reserves that are coming through the Asia Pacific. Potential concerns if there were a great power conflict with the United States, for example. The ability to cut off supplies of oil, energy resources to China would be quite easy for the United States. And so there was a lot of theory in China about branching out to the West, having these land corridors in places like Central Asia to diversify their energy resources. And of course, securing transit routes is part of that. The Belt and Road Initiative was launched in Kazakhstan for good reason. Symbolically, of course, it harkens back to the Silk Roads, which China wields for soft power in the region, thinking back to historical connectivity, trade routes that went across Central Asia, connecting China and Europe. Today, those ancient roads are being invoked as part of China's modern-day strategy to create a China-centric international trade order in opposition to the United States-led order. So Central Asia is a very important role within that, as it is the route, the bulk of lots of the land corridors that are going through Eurasia, they start in Central Asia. So that's why the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in Kazakhstan, and why Central Asia is so symbolically and materially important to China and China's vision of global governance, global order as well. And then finally, positioning itself as a global leader. One thing we talk about in the book quite a lot is that Central Asia often is kind of a laboratory for China's experiments in global governance. A lot of early frameworks, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China's alternative to creating a multilateral framework of authoritarian-leaning states or security-centric states, really was one of the first experiments for China in global governance, and it occurred in Central Asia. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative I've mentioned was launched in Central Asia as well, another experiment. And of course, even to security today, China has, interesting, as Ed pointed out, with the border security, has its own multilateral framework, which it works with the governments of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan on border management. This is quite a unique experiment for China. It's also very interesting because it's the first organization that China has spun off that doesn't involve Russia, which shows a lot more Chinese assertion in the region, or China becoming more confident. This was talking about the threats, just to contextualize that there were a lot of concerns in China around 2014. The idea that as the US was winding down its conflict in Afghanistan, that Afghanistan would become this spillover region of instability into its own borders. And so there were concerns of fighters returning from conflicts in Syria as well and coming back through the Wakhan corridor into Xinjiang. This kind of rhetoric starts to really appear in 2014. And that's really when we see lots of changes in China's security approaches. One of the things we do in this book is talk a lot about data, unpacking changes in China's security approaches to the region. This is very interesting because it shows 2021, the rates of China's arms market in Central Asia. Before 2014, China's arms market was around 2%. Russia's has stayed relatively stable. So you see after 2014, with these growing security concerns with Xinjiang, that China starts to become more actively involved in security. It starts doing a lot more arms trading, getting more involved in the market in Central Asia. What's really interesting is that Russia is historically dominant as the region's security guarantor. But as China has grown, it's actually not eaten into Russia's market share. Russia's market share has actually remained stable. So a lot of questions in Washington, as Dr. Cooley pointed out, about this idea of tensions between Russia and China. Are there tensions, or are they kind of working together? And I think the data is interesting because they haven't really been competitors so much as China has pushed out NATO allies of the region, which is very interesting. The data shows that China's actually helping Russia's agenda of minimizing NATO presence in the region. Similarly, on the theme of Central Asian agency, I think what's important to note is there's a lot of discussion about if the US withdraws from a region, does this mean it becomes a vacuum that China fills or that Russia fills? What we're seeing in our data is something very different, which is actually that Central Asia is just becoming far more multinational, multilateral. We're seeing a lot more diversity of security actors in the region. Then when you look at the early 90s, there's a lot of dominance of Russia, NATO. From 2014 onwards, China starts to operate a lot more bilaterally, not just with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India becomes more active, of course, the CSTO. So we have a lot more diversity of security partnerships. This is for training exercises across the region. We brought down a lot of data comparing different exercises, who's running them. And so that's interesting that we do see this multi-vectorism of Central Asia does lead to a lot more variety of security partnerships rather than just merely Russian-Chinese dominance. And it's the same reflected in economic data as well, that we see that Central Asia, although it's still China's far and away the most dominant economic power in the region now, which again is a huge transformance from the past where Russia was dominant. At the end of the Soviet Union, Russia accounted for some 90% of all regional trade. We see that that picture has changed dramatically. But actors such as the EU play a very important role in diversifying Central Asia's trade. So we shouldn't just think of it as a Russian or Chinese dominated region. It's a region that is making strides toward diversifying these partnerships. I'll let Ed take over to talk about the forms of backlash that we're seeing. Right to that. Over.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, the book really focuses on
growing agency of Central Asians. And so particularly we were interested in the ways in which Central Asians were exercising their agency on the street. And so back when we first created Oxus back in 2020, we built this big protest data set of thousands of events across the region, protests related to all sorts of different things. But what we found in that data set was that China was being singled out more than other countries, right? Though not to say that there weren't protests against the United States, not to say there weren't protests against Russia, but 70% of the protests that we found against foreign actors were against Chinese businesses or against the Chinese government and its policies in Xinjiang. And so, yes, because I think this is from a protest in Western Kazakhstan, and I think because they wanted to capture the attention of international audiences. Often this was 2019, I think, in Kazakhstan. Often the protests that year they would have English language signs to try and generate broader attention. And so we were interested in kind of observations from survey data that we had on the region. And so the Central Asia Barometer that collected until recently kind of public opinion data in the region, pointed to China being singled out as a country that people were concerned about, right? This is about people's, whether they had negative opinions or of China, and 38% of Kazakhstanis, 27% of Kyrgyz, and 64% of Uzbeks expressed negative opinions towards China in 2023. This is much higher than levels of negative opinion towards Russia, relatively on a par with negative opinions towards the United States. So again, we don't want to say that China's being singled out or there's something wrong with China per se, or that people aren't opposed to other countries, but I think in terms of the protests and the public opinion data, there is some evidence that China is being targeted. And so these percentages have increased over time. We see at the bottom the figures from 2017. And so negative opinions of China have risen. We overlaid that with our protest data. So again, you can see protests really peaking in 2021, 2019, particularly in Kazakhstan. So this was also at a time of transition in that country from a first president, Nazarbayev, to the second president, Tokayev. And a lot of the protests were kind of throwing China in with a whole host of other concerns around constitutional reform, around political prisoners, and so on and so forth. And China was kind of found itself in that whole host of different issues. In terms of where the protests are taking place, perhaps unsurprisingly, the big circles are where the most protests took place. That's Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty to the bottom right, Bishkek below it, on the border with Kyrgyzstan. But also in other areas of extraction, Western Kazakhstan is particularly where most of the oil and gas comes from. A lot of protests there around China's role in the oil and gas industry. And so, a number of kind of data points stick out from the field work and data that we collected. We did over 80 interviews across the region and collected data on various different things, including protests related to China. And so, we managed to kind of analyze that. China's presence in the region had sparked historic protests. The first mass protests in Kazakhstan's independent history were related to land reform proposals in 2016. Basically, the government said you could lease land to foreign entities or foreign citizens for a lengthy amount of time, and people read that as being China, and they protested against it. So China is unique insofar as it's generating these concerns. The governments are also particularly concerned around protests related to China in keeping China happy. We saw that our regression analysis pointed to a disproportionate number of the protests related to China being broken up violently by police in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And so we analyzed a number of different issues we can dig into in greater detail in the Q&A that drive this xenophobia in the region, from human rights concerns around the situation in Xinjiang, where you can see relatives here protesting in Almaty in Kazakhstan, people whose relatives are being detained across the border in China, through to issues around land and concerns that China, given its large kind of population on the borders of Central Asia, is interested in expanding into Central Asia, and the ideas of Chinese entities leasing land, taking control of land are particularly apparent. Disputes over labor conditions, concerns around the environmental degradation by Chinese firms, concerns over sovereignty, given especially that some Chinese nationalist historians claim parts of Central Asia were historically Chinese, much in the way that Russian nationalists would claim that parts of Central Asia are historically Russians. That elevates these insecurities, concerns around corruption, and concerns around kind of issues of inter-ethnic marriage and so on and so forth. And so we were interested in Sinophobia, but also how China's responding. And I think a big takeaway from the book, and in particular the last 2 substantive chapters in the book, look at how China has been attuned to this, has been responding to this, has been trying to adapt its approach to the region. And so we've seen it kind of move quietly on certain projects that were controversial. There was a large $270 million logistics terminal near the border between Kyrgyzstan and China that was cancelled after protests in 2020. But quietly, China has continued that project with the agreement of the Kyrgyz government, but has been a little bit it's moved that center away from population centers. And so it's adapted its approach in that way. China's been attuned to the idea that people are upset around too many Chinese workers being hired, and so they've increased the number of Central Asian workers being brought into different projects. They've started new initiatives such as the Luban workshops that teach practical skills to individuals from Central Asia. They've increased the number of scholarships available to Central Asians, and they've even opened branch campuses for the first time in Central Asia, including the Silk Road University in Uzbekistan. So they're really trying to kind of push Central Asia up the value chain. Another thing they've been involved in, the footage to the bottom right, is President Tokayev in Kazakhstan visiting a manufacturing plant for a joint project between Kazakhstan and China on the production of electric vehicles. And so they've been interested in pushing away from being purely focused on extraction towards being focused on joint production and higher skill jobs. They've also been involved in something we're writing on now for MBR, is a piece on joint archaeological projects, the ways in which they're using the past and interpretations of the past to show China's continued benign influence in the region since over the past 2,000 years or more, and kind of reframing the modern Silk Road as a continuation of those linkages. And they've been pushing into local media, buying up local media, placing content with local media to try and push the narrative in ways that are favorable to China. And so, what are the main takeaways? Certainly, Central Asian agency is growing. It's no longer a backyard for countries like Russia and China. It's increasingly Central Asians in differing positions are trying to influence and shape global politics in distinct ways. China and its footing in the region is vulnerable to a degree, right? It's generated public backlash and local resistance in various different ways. Again, not unique to Central Asia, but Central Asia very much at the cutting edge of China's rise, as Bradley mentioned. And, from a more policy-oriented perspective, there are certain policies that the United States, other actors may adopt to capitalize on this from the perspective of great power competition, speaking in a very DC way, given we're from DC. Xenophobia is largely structural, not ideological. People often are sino-agnostic. They don't know much about China, and that lack of knowledge of China allows actors to come in and frame China in negative ways and to spread rumors and so on and so forth. Often these are layered on with other concerns, as I said, around corruption, around lack of transparency, governance practices in the region that China is seen as feeding. As Bradley mentioned, Russia and China are cooperating more than competing in the region. This is starting to change to a degree as China increasingly goes it alone, adopting its own multilateral formats, as Bradley mentioned, and increasingly pushing into areas where Russia was traditionally dominant, such as security. Thus far, they've been deconflicting. China's been deferential to Russia in this regard. China has been engaging, for example, in its military exercises that Bradley mentioned, with local security agencies, with national guards, with border forces. Russia has been engaging with those, but more so than China, also with the militaries. So there's kind of ways in which they're trying to deconflict their agendas in the region that are relatively aligned. But over time, as Russia slowly declines in the region, as China continues to rise, this could be changing. Ultimately, I think the story of our book, as I said, is about the agency of local people, their concerns, civil society, media outlets, and certainly policy engagement should go beyond merely government-to-government linkages, because a lot of this is going on below the levels of governments. But we'll end it there so we can go to Q&A. Happy to develop on any points that we've made in the presentation with Elizabeth over the questions.
All right, Professor Wishnick, what say you?
Well, there's a lot in this book that they didn't talk about, so I urge everyone to read it because it's a very meaty book with a lot of excellent data. So I'm just going to make some general comments, my impressions of the book, and then I'm going to raise some questions for discussion. And I hope you'll all think of questions during this period as well. So this summer, some of us, Andy included, took a trip up Shimbulak Mountain outside of Almaty in Kazakhstan. And one striking development was that only electric cars are allowed in the upper zone. And most of these electric cars are Chinese. And so Chinese EVs have really replaced a lot of other vehicles in Kazakhstan. They're less expensive than Japanese cars, for example. And so that was a striking example to me about how Chinese technology is making inroads. But is China making inroads? That's the question. So people like Chinese cars, but do they like China's influence? And there's a mixed picture there. I find that every time I go to the region, I end up more confused about what people are thinking. Because if you look at the public opinion data, it provides a lot of conflicting answers. And you both have done a great service in terms of collecting a lot of excellent data. But it really depends on the question. So if you ask a question about how people feel about Chinese land ownership, as you mentioned, very negative. You have overwhelmingly negative answers. But if you ask about other aspects of China's engagement in the region, you have more positive responses. And in the case of Kazakhstan, which is the country I've been following more closely, for example, in this Central Asian Barometer survey, which was published in late 24, the last one, there was some improvement in the opinion of China. 60% had a positive view, but the percentage of negative views also increased from 20 to 30%. So what do we make of that? It's confusing. And if you talk to people, I've done 3 series of interviews in Kazakhstan, and you have very different viewpoints. Like take sovereignty, for example. Some people are very worried about China's potential impact on sovereignty. But then others feel that Xi Jinping's statement to President Tokayev claiming that China was interested in supporting Kazakhstan's sovereignty was a good thing. Personally, I was skeptical, but if you look at how China has responded to the Iran events, for example. So you have efforts by China to cultivate goodwill by taking people on expense-paid trips to Xinjiang, where they're try to be convinced about how wonderful everything is in Xinjiang. But others, even regardless of these trips, will say that China is still the other, still not very understood. And Russia might be the country they worry about now, but it's the worrisome country they understand better. So it's quite confusing. And another thing is that time is not on China's side in terms of dealing with this backlash. Timur Umarov, the Central Asian expert at Carnegie, has talked about the demographics in the region and how society in Central Asia is increasingly disconnected from the leadership. 60% of people in Central Asia are under 30, for example. And Chinese analysts are very worried about this too, because these under 30 Central Asians are very much engaged with Western media, Western social media, and are looking west, not towards China. And so also at the same time, Chinese society has a reduced space, and so it's not as attractive to these young people. And so I think that's a strength of Backlash, in that it does look from the ground up at the different populations in the different countries. And we didn't get as much a sense in the presentation, but if you read the book, you get a taste of how China's influence is different in the different countries, with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan more economically vulnerable, and you have Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that have more alternatives, and Turkmenistan is more the energy partner. And you do have the original data sets. And I think you do get a clear understanding of Central Asian agency and the different responses and reactions that we all encounter when we go to the region. So I have a few questions that we can try to think about. I liked how you set out to show that what's important for us to know is how Central Asians view their own region, not some kind of arena for others to be acting at the expense of Central Asians. So I wonder, are views about China in Central Asia connected to their views of other countries? So do they see China in a certain way because their relationship with Russia is evolving, because the U.S. position in the world is changing? Does that affect how they see China? Or does it have more to do with the individual history that each country has had with China in terms of shifting borders and so forth? And you also posit in the book that Central Asia is a test case for China's effort to reshape the global order. So do you think China is learning? I mean, you talk a little bit about adaptation at the end. But is China trying to take advantage of these other global trends to try to adjust, to see perhaps what Russia has done well or what the U.S. has done wrong? Or are they learning from other countries as well? And what about these adaptation efforts? So I wonder about those, like the Confucius Institutes, we were talking about that earlier. There are many in Central Asia. Do they really change what people think about China? I mean, here the experience in the U.S. has not been positive. Most of them closed. And I know in Central Asia, people think that these institutes are going to help them get a job with a Chinese company. But are they actually going to learn enough Chinese to do that? Or is China more interested in hiring ethnically Central Asian people from China, who are Chinese nationals, who speak the local languages instead? Because it's not just about knowing Chinese, it's about understanding the Chinese system, which people from Central Asia would not be able to do as well. And finally, those C5+1 photographs that you showed in the beginning. So Central Asians are trying to engage with a multitude of countries. So what is China's impact on all of this? Do you think China is welcoming this kind of engagement, or does it make it more difficult for China to accomplish its interests in the region? So I could ask you many more questions. It's a really thought-provoking book, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
I guess I can take the first part. I really liked they picked up on, of course, EV vehicles, very popular in the region now. In the last couple of times I've been to Uzbekistan, it's been quite amazing how all the cars seemingly have been replaced by Chinese EV vehicles. People are very proud of their EV vehicles. I've spent many a cab ride where they were telling me all about them, and they were very comfortable.
But we just switch your.
It's not working? Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. But what's interesting is looking at that, the EV is a form of soft power, that people are aware they're Chinese cars, that they're benefiting their lives. But on the other hand, you have wariness around some Chinese technology. We look at the role of surveillance technology in the region. Okay. So there was a lot of public concern about surveillance technology over recent years, especially cameras that track things like traffic violations, or even discussions about technology that has. Don't hold it so close to you. Ah, is this better? Okay. Sorry, I've not done many in-person events for a while. Everything's Zoom these days. Yeah, I need retraining. So yeah, there's been a lot of discussions with Chinese technology in terms of surveillance, about data protection, the kind of debates that we have here in the West when it comes to Chinese technology, and about the limits on personal freedom and so on. So I think it's very interesting that even with something like technology, debates and perceptions of China vary quite widely and quite wildly sometimes. In terms of perceptions, of course, one of the big takeaway I had from most of my interviews in the region certainly is that it's not that people are negative toward China or positive. It's overwhelmingly ambivalent. People simply do not know much about China. And that creates a vulnerability around perceptions of China that they can be filled by negative actors, such as populist figures who want to take advantage of grievances or tie China to elites. And and there are some of those things are real concerns as well, not to minimize them. But there is this vulnerability of where there is just a complete misunderstanding of China, China's motivations, and just engagement with Chinese culture. When we look at things like Confucius Institutes, of course, they've been set up across the region to promote Chinese language. But speaking with people at those Confucius Institutes and, learning Chinese, very difficult, is many, many years. Dropout rates after the first year, I was told, are something like above 60%. So for every classroom, the less than half by the end of the first year. It drops again significantly by the end of the second year. So the number of people that follow through to professional working proficiency for the job market, we're talking very small figures. And when we look at scholarships, China has invested quite a lot in scholarships and initiatives to bring Central Asians to study and to learn Mandarin in China. And those have definitely created a lot of great opportunities. A lot of Central Asians are taking advantage of these. Some of them have built very successful careers engaging with China. But they're still very small in the grand scheme of things. Russia's still overwhelmingly much larger in terms of offering education opportunities. And China has a very long way to go till it could possibly displace or compete. And that's before even getting into the labor market, thinking about the millions of labor migrants from across Central Asia who go to work in Russia every year. And especially after the conflict in Ukraine, there's been even bigger demand for Central Asian workers to fill the gaps in Russia's economy. And so that is a form of very powerful soft power engagement with Russia. And could be negative as well, because a lot of Central Asians go to Russia, they experience racism and hostility. But it's still an engagement with Russia, by and large, in terms of language engagement and so on, is just overwhelming. Not to tackle some of the others.
Yeah, on the first question of changing perceptions, it's something we mention in the book, but because it's kind of against Backlash, we maybe vary a little bit more, and maybe it's for a sequel to the book. But yes, as you said, particularly in Kazakhstan, the latest data from Central Asia Barometer said that attitudes had improved, right? And I think we can point to, and at the same time, attitudes towards Russia had declined, and so I think the two probably are related, as Kazakhstan has a very long border. The longest continuous border between two countries in the world is between Kazakhstan and Russia, and there's a great concern over Russia's potential encroachments, and obviously its invasion of Ukraine. And so I think whilst opinions of Russia and Kazakhstan have suffered, especially by younger generations, because we broke out their data by age, and younger generations, as you say, which are now becoming the majority, have a more negative attitude towards Russia. But attitudes towards China have made a small improvement. So I think they are related to one another, I would say, with relative confidence. Certainly the other kind of interviews that we were conducting were saying similar, that we lost confidence in Russia as a security guarantor. We now see it as a threat. And, China, with Xi Jinping coming in September 2022 and making these statements around supporting Kazakhstan's sovereignty, that was relatively positively received in the region. So I think, they are related in those ways. I think, I think, as Bradley said, I think one of the main takeaways was that people just don't know much about China. They don't have much contact with China or with Chinese people, and I think that definitely opens up the way for different groups. We look at the way in which terrorist organizations, populists, and others try and use that for their advantage.
It's my turn to ask a question. Thank you so much for great presentations. The book sounds very, very interesting. I'd like to ask a sort of overarching question about this slide. China's footing is vulnerable. So at the beginning, you listed 6 or 7 Chinese goals, transportation and economic. I don't see from your presentation how any of those goals is vulnerable. to this backlash. And that's a kind of global pattern often. There's a lot of backlash globally against China, but they still seem to be getting what they want. So I was wondering about elaboration on the vulnerability side.
Yeah, I think overarching we of course know that there are power disparities between China and the Central Asian republics. Many of them are very reliant on China and of course have to be careful about keeping China happy. We point in the book to a number of prominent examples. The cancellation of the logistics terminal in Kyrgyzstan was one, but then of course over time that was resumed and you went there and you interviewed with the people. You can maybe mention that. So I think, China's presence I think at a macro level, China will continue to rise in the region. I think we were more interested in the ways in which, terrorist attacks and cancelled projects and scandals that result in the government of Kyrgyzstan having to resign in the case of a Chinese-funded hot water plant in Bishkek, in the capital city, that broke down at the height of winter, and that was found to have been, the corruption scandal related to the Chinese company that had repaired that particular facility. So there are these cases where China's presence has generated this pushback, and it's had to rethink its presence in the region. So I would say vulnerability is not to say that China won't continue to play a key role in the region, won't continue to play a rising role in the region, but more that it's kind of complicating. So maybe vulnerability is the wrong word on a macro level. It's kind of complicating China's presence. China's having to adapt in response.
Similar in cases where the virality of content, especially with social media, where certain claims about China's investments, or even land purchases, they become like a wildfire the way they spread. It's, again, that different actors can kind of take advantage of this situation. At the moment, I think vulnerability, you're right, that when you follow the news story, there's a backlash or a project gets shut down. More often than not, that project gets restarted. But you could, to be a little bit speculative, you could imagine a scenario where Russia-China relationship starts to break down, and that if Russia wanted to engage its huge information advantage in the region to start spreading stories about China or fomenting that kind of sentiment. I think what we mean by vulnerability is China hasn't invested enough in a counter narrative or having a strong enough position in the region that if an actor did want to start kind of undermining China's initiatives in the region, I think it would be quite easy to do so. And we've seen cases of that where grassroots movements have caught, they've taken on like a wildfire. Someone asked an interesting question earlier, which was, why was the sign in English? I think that's a great example where, tracking thousands of protest incidents across the region in recent years, we've seen anti-China signs and narratives appearing at very disparate protest movements, even things for protesting the government's cuts of benefits for disabled women, for example. There are lots of anti-China signs present at these protests because people know that it gets some traction even for movements and issues that don't necessarily involve them or causes. So people are kind of using the China specter as a way to mobilize around certain issues in the region as well that don't even have a China angle per se. And I think that that's an interesting trend that we've seen happening more and more, which kind of suggests that there is some kind of vulnerability there.
So Andy asked the big picture question. I want to drill down on one particular episode that I think probably brings out some of the dynamics that you're studying in the book. So one of the interesting dimensions of the fall of the global story of the re-education camps in Xinjiang was the fact that, yes, we discussed them in the context of the Uyghurs, but tens of thousands of Kazakh co-nationals also passed through these camps. And this became quite an activist issue domestically in Kazakhstan. And for probably like a year and a half, just correct me if I get the timeline wrong, it seemed that, documenting the plight of these Kazakh co-ethnics who had passed through the camps. There was a YouTube campaign, right? The videos were being shot. There was an NGO that was very active in sort of, projecting this. And then all of a sudden, the NGO is banned, right? Its leader has to flee. It comes to an end. And, China's favorability tends to go up. So, take us through that case study, right? Of how this activated Kazakh civil society, and ultimately how did the Kazakh government sort of shut it down? And let's be interested in hearing your perspective on this too, as an issue.
Guess you're referring to Atajurt and Backlash. And so, yeah, that was kind of, I think the other layer to this was that was also taking place during this power transition between Nazarbayev and Tokayev, and that kind of opened up this space for protests. We're thinking of the period kind of 2019, 2021. It's also a time when we're obviously hearing increasing international reports around what was happening in Xinjiang and then the re-education camps. And obviously there were 1 million ethnic Kazakhs in China, and many of them with families on the other side of the border in Kazakhstan. And so there was this kind of civil society movement, and it was being thrown in with a whole host of other issues and protests against the government at that time. And we did see then I think that 200 Kazakhs were released after a negotiation between the Kazakh government and China. So clearly there was an awareness of that issue and a back and forth. But ultimately, over time, China has kind of pressured the government of Kazakhstan to kind of crack down on this activism. We've seen, as you say, Atajurt's members being arrested, its leader having to leave the country. And we've seen others who've been uncovering China's human rights abuses in Xinjiang being arrested. And even the Central Asia Barometer, which used to collect data on public opinion, was closed in part because of pressure. And one of its researchers in Tajikistan was arrested in part because she was asking questions around China. So there's certainly, there's both the approach of the soft power approach, but China's also using its leverage to kind of squash and silence these movements, which shows it shows a sense of vulnerability and a concern. And another thing, we have a paper coming out at some point on kind of these tours that Elizabeth mentioned, and kind of China's work to kind of push the media space in Central Asia in more favorable views towards its policies in Xinjiang, framing Xinjiang as a kind of model that can be emulated in Central Asia in terms of development.
I'll just say that I think that the shift has been towards more quiet diplomacy rather than having people protest in the street. But there's a wide variation in reactions, because there are a lot of people who have been resettled from Xinjiang to Kazakhstan, and so there's a lot of good awareness of the situation. So that's interesting, but the awareness is coming at a time when Kazakhstan is cracking down on protests in general. So I don't know that it's only China's pressure, but I think there's a perception that dealing with it quietly is more effective. And it's similar with water issues, which is something I've studied in China-Kazakhstan relations, another source of dissatisfaction, because China controls a good amount of the water that Kazakhstan receives, and that amount is decreasing. And so this has been more of a subject of quiet diplomacy rather than overt pushback. That seems to be seen as more promising.
I think that's true. That the government, but I mean, we've even seen that with the United States, where under the first administration, Pompeo went out to Central Asia to try and publicly get the governments to take a stance on the Xinjiang issue, or getting the Central Asian governments to criticize China's policies. But of course, it kind of fell flat, or it pushed them into an awkward position where, again, the Central Asian governments, they don't want to be part of this great power politics. They want to be able to continue doing their relations with China, to continue to work with the US. And so when they're forced to take a side, it becomes a very awkward position for them. So yes, the Kazakh government has preferred this quiet strategy of engaging with their Chinese counterparts to try and get ethnic Kazakhs released from Xinjiang detention centers and repatriated in Kazakhstan. There have been a number of releases in recent years.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, your comment sort of underscores one of the reasons which the second Trump administration is so popular with Central Asian governments is the fact that they're not being put in a position to pick sides, right? As they were from being pressured to sort of side with Ukraine against Russia, or you mentioned the first Trump administration, Pompeo gets sent out in Central Asia, sort of talks about how you all have to break away from China, and sort of these blank stares are sort of put on him. So there's a real appreciation that transactionalism for them means not having to choose, right? And they can sort of engage on their own terms. Okay, you've been very patient. Let's open it up to your questions, and let's do. We'll gather 2 or 3 questions at a time. Just tell us who you are. Oh, okay. Well, what's the? Okay, we have to go to the. Oh, we have to stand to the mic. Okay, my bad as a moderator for not knowing the very basic logistics of the Q&A. So let's. Yep. Tom, absolutely. You get first dibs. Like,
all right,
your name has been invoked. So
so I'm Tom Christensen. I run the China and the World program here. We're one of the co-sponsors of this event. And you said during your presentation that China had a military base in Central Asia, and that struck me as surprising and unusual. But then you said it was a people's own police base, and there's very good work being done by my colleague Sheena Chestnut-Greitens at the University of Texas, Austin, on how China is exerting its influence not through standard traditional military means, but through police cooperation throughout the world with various regimes, some actually democratic, but a lot of them authoritarian. And it seemed maybe more like that. So that's the first part of my question. The second part of my question is, you've talked about these protests, and I was struck by how many protests there were, because there's been a kind of deafening silence from the governments of Muslim majority countries throughout Asia, not just in Central Asia, but in Southeast Asia, about the, this incredible human rights violation in Xinjiang with the re-education camps. And we hosted a talk here at Columbia, I think about 5 years ago, with the law school, China and the World with the law school. And we had a former fellow, Matthew Irie, who is kind of an anthropologist and law expert, studies China and Islam, both at home and abroad. And there were a few other people there. And they surprised me, because I was very puzzled by this deafening silence in Malaysia and Indonesia and Central Asian states. And they said, well, that's because the Central Asian states all did this themselves in the past. That they had forced re-education against Islamic fundamentalism in their own countries. And maybe the population is upset, but the state isn't going to criticize China for doing this. Is that true? I mean, I'm still remembering this and how surprising it was. Is that your impression as well, that they're kind of sympathetic to what China's trying to do in Xinjiang because they did it 30 years ago or something like that?
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, let's take another one in the bundle. And do we have an alternate mic? Okay, great.
Hi. Okay. I'm Kala. I'm a PhD student in political science. And I had 2 questions. The first one is, I'm wondering to what extent this is like an anti-foreign or like a nationalism story. Like, so I spent a year in Kazakhstan, and one of my impressions was that people were kind of like, very proud to be Kazakh or from Kazakhstan. And so I'm wondering, like, some of the things you mentioned about sovereignty, like, is this just like a please don't touch our country? Like, we want, jobs to go to Kazakhs or whatever other resources, like we don't want to be sort of infringed upon. And so what role does nationalism play, I guess, in short? And then my second question is somewhat related, but you were mentioning that there are some local actors, who there's this vulnerable space who can influence people's opinions on China. So who are these main local actors that you're referring to? Like, I understand that there's maybe some populists or extremist organizations, but can you maybe give a more deeper dive into that? And like, what about the people who, let's say, like work or interact? I mean, locals who work or interact with Chinese nationals at the Belt and Road projects or in these companies, or are they like totally segregated? There's no interaction. So I was just wondering if you could speak more on that because I haven't had the chance to read your book yet. I'm sure you talk more about it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So a lot of food for thought. Let's go with some brief responses to those. I think 4 separate ones, and then we'll carry on with the list.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you for those questions. I guess I'll address the first two. We may have misspoke. It's actually a reconnaissance facility, not a military facility, and it is linked with the People's Armed Police, which is the paramilitary wing of the Chinese Communist Party. There were discussions actually in Beijing where Russian think tankers, policy makers were kind of brought to discuss this initially because there was worries that it would be controversial to have Chinese soldiers stationed in Central Asia. So there was thoughts and thinking at the time that it was made the paramilitary wing to be less politically sensitive. The facility really is about reconnaissance, about information gathering in the Wakhan. It's very much centered on this threat from this quote that I showed about 2014 about China's concern that Uyghur fighters returning from the conflict in Syria using this corridor as a conduit. So it's a reconnaissance facility. And as you say, China is very much involved in police work in Central Asia, more so than military. One of the things that we didn't show is a data set we have that compares the types of military engagement across the region, the training that they're doing. China overwhelmingly relies on working with National Guard units, counter-terror forces, doing counter-terrorist kind of drills and exercises rather than conventional military-to-military cooperation, which Russia does a lot more of, the United States to some extent as well, in disaster relief. But China's very much focused on these security and policing type issues, which is very interesting because a point that we make a lot is that China has quite a domestically oriented security footprint in the region. It's thinking about its defense of Xinjiang. And then the other point about the solidarity that, of course, across much of the Muslim world, there's been a lot of surprise from people. There hasn't been a lot more outrage about what's happening in Xinjiang and about suppression of Muslims. I think with Central Asia, or at least more work needs to be done on this, what I found a lot is that ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, they're not so much sympathetic of what's happening to the Uyghurs. It's often simply because ethnic Kazakhs are being put in the detention centers. And so I think that a lot of these protests, it's not so much that people are appalled by the human rights or the suppression of religion. It's the suppression and arrest of Kazakhs who have relatives across the border. Yes. It's often framed just through this nationalist lens. And I think that oftentimes in my conversations with Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, it's just been the framing of the issue from a nationalist lens.
They did the same thing. They do it because they're Turkic minority.
Exactly.
And that builds to the second set of questions. Yes, it is a nationalism question. We have a kind of chapter where we talk about nationalism in the region. Yes, so exactly. These concerns are by individuals who are, they're worried about sovereignty, they're worried about land, they're worried about interethnic marriage, and framing that along the Chinese have a plan to come and marry all our women. They have the one-child policy and so on and so forth, and they're going to, pollute our, our sacred blood, and these kind of narratives that come forth, and they are being mobilized by certain groups. In Kyrgyzstan, there's a group called 40 Knights, and again, it's a nationalist movement. It's a vigilante movement, really, that did raids on like Chinese businesses to arrest illegal workers, but they also raided brothels, nightclubs, and arrested prostitutes, and so it's kind of wrapped up in the kind of anti-LGBTQ agenda, and they've broken up women's marches and feminist organizations in the country. So they're throwing China in with this whole other kind of traditional values agenda, and then there are terrorist organizations, as I said, also focused on this, and they are framing the kind of Xinjiang issue more along the kind of Ummah and attacks how is China as the kind of apostate, anti-religious state that's persecuting our fellow brother Muslims and so on and so forth. So they take that framing, but of course that's very marginal, and the audience for that is pretty small.
Okay. Let's go back for round 2. And can I ask you to ask one question? Like, we're at the part, like, no 2-part questions, because let's get everyone involved. Yeah. No, you're good. Co-sponsors get lots of questions. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. A great panel. Look forward to reading the book. My name is Aaron Glasserman. I'm a historian of China at UPenn, also PhD from Columbia. I wanted to ask about the states that together make up Central Asia, and both how do their interests, I mean, there must be some conflicts between them. How do those play out, and to what extent is China aware of and trying to manipulate or take advantage of, the differences between what Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan wants, or how those political systems operate for that matter? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Anton. I'm a first-year student in the Masters International Affairs. I had a question about the fourth bullet point about Russia and China kind of cooperating now, but maybe moving towards competing. Just wondering if you thought there were certain sectors that were kind of likely to see that competition in, and if so, what does that mean for countries in navigating it? Does it kind of create some opportunities, or is it more kind of perils and risks in terms of not offending either China or Russia? Thank you.
Super, thank you. Should we do one more? Put it in the mix? Who else in the queue? Yeah, please.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. I'm a student at Columbia College, very interested in sort of broader economics, especially pertaining to East Asia and sort of global affairs. So my question was about the data in regards to the arms trading that was happening, sort of the changes that we're seeing in the proportion of countries that are dealing in these kinds of things with Central Asia. So I noticed the U.S. and NATO are, over the past, 25 years or so, have been engaging less and less. And so my question for you guys, in the meanwhile, we have, Chinese groups, Russian groups, et cetera, other powers playing influence. And so I wanted to ask, what foreign policy implications does this imply for the U.S.? And of course, was this change sort of prompted by Central Asian kind of countries, or maybe what was it prompted by?
Great. Okay, let's chew on those. Actually, Liz, can we go to you first on the Russia-China question? Because I know this is something that you have thought and written quite a bit about.
Yeah. Well, I'll start it off because I think our colleagues have some comments on that as well. So there's this conventional wisdom that China takes care of the economic sector and Russia focuses on the security sector. And personally, I think that misunderstands how involved Russia is in the Central Asian economies and the resource sectors in particular, where Russia, for example, if you look at Kazakhstan, 80% of Kazakh oil is exported via Russian territory. So that gives Russia very strong leverage over Kazakhstan. And similarly, in the uranium sector, you see a big role for Russia in the economy. So I think that we have to dig down a little bit about Russia's role, even though Russia's weakened because of the war in Ukraine. It still has a lot of influence, cultural power, even if it's seen more negatively and more fearfully because of the long border with Kazakhstan. I think Russia has been trying to maintain its influence, having more meetings, calling up leaders, trying to stay in the game as China becomes more economically involved. So I think they're both economically involved. And as we saw from the presentation, the security sector is still much more connected to Russia in terms of formal military interactions. I do think that Russia tries to keep its role at the expense of China. Chinese experts certainly complain that Russian language publications badmouth them in Central Asia. And I even observed this personally myself, seeing how a delegation of Russian officials spoke with Kazakh officials. And it was very interesting to see. So I think there's a degree of competition, and China has been very mindful of trying not to cause tensions with Russia over this area. They recognize it's sensitive, but they nonetheless have been expanding their influence. So I think that so far they have a kind of equilibrium, but I think it's premature to say that Russia is on the way out. I think Russia's very much trying to maintain its position there, and China's trying to increase its own. So we'll see what happens with the situation in Ukraine and other matters, how that evolves.
Okay, Bradley?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that question, I agree that the relations are largely in equilibrium. But we of course see some shifting, which is with Chinese connectivity projects connecting Europe with Asia. There's now competitive southern corridors which bypass Russia. Of course, that's not a politically neutral point where they can converge that will disadvantage Russia. I think that's quite interesting. And we even have J.D. Vance at the moment is in the South Caucasus talking about the Trump corridor connecting the South Caucasus across the Caspian with Central Asia. And that's kind of interesting as well, because it also, in a way, tries to leverage China's connectivity, but to also integrate a US-focused lens about exporting Central Asian critical minerals through the South Caucasus to the West. So there's kind of this interesting competition emerging among connectivity. But at the same time, oftentimes Russian and Chinese relations are not at odds in Central Asia. And I would add the US's aims in the region are not always at odds with Russia and China either. And I think there are kind of grounds for working together. Connectivity can be beneficial, but there are some tensions with that, as we're saying, with these southern corridors and the way they could compete with Russia's leverage long term. Would it disrupt the broader Sino-Russian relations? I don't think so, because they have larger strategic objectives at the moment. But if the relations started to break down, of course, this would be a potential region that would be a pressure point.
On that first question around kind of coordination, I think even though there are all these C5 meetings that I put up on the first slide, I think Central Asian officials have told me themselves that there's a limited amount of cooperation, right? China prefers to interact as Russia does with these countries bilaterally. And for the most part, the outcomes of these meetings are, there's no kind of multilateral agreements that emerge from them. It's more of an opportunity for Xi Jinping to have bilateral meetings with these individuals. In last year, it was in Kazakhstan. The year before, it was in China, right? So, and certainly Russia is very happy that takes place, and Russia has been very opposed to the Central Asian governments getting together, as they have done every year since 2018. So, although there've been some movement towards kind of increasing trade in the region, some defense cooperation, joint military exercises, and so on and so forth, Filippo Costa-Buranelli wrote an interesting piece about this as kind of balancing regionalism. But, I think that's the kind of aspiration to a degree, to kind of use this kind of horizontal cooperation to balance against kind of being reliant on any one external power. But there's not too much kind of cooperation going on at this point. In terms of the US relationship, I think looking at our data, it obviously peaked kind of post 9/11. That's when we saw the largest number of exercises in the region. It's where we saw kind of defense ties becoming stronger. At one point, there were NATO countries had bases in three of the five countries in the region. But really, kind of in the kind of mid-2010s, that's when the first withdrawal from Afghanistan was proposed. That's when defense kind of ties were the strongest in terms of security assistance. But since then, all the bases have been closed. The US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. Now the amount of security assistance to the region is very paltry. Of course, we have to see where it's going to go under the Trump administration with the re-engagement over critical minerals. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have both joined the Board of Peace. Right, they were both recently at the Critical Minerals Ministerial last week in DC, and we'll see where that relationship goes. It's obviously very transactional, as Alex said.
Yeah, and a lot of that security assistance was informal quid pro quo for basing, refueling, and access rights which are gone. Okay, perfect. Let's go rapid fire. I would love to get everyone in. Panelists, you're going to get like 2 minutes each to sort of wrap up and answer these questions. So let's do it.
Thank you. I just want to ask you, so during this presentation, you talk a lot about China's involvement with Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and the protests that took place in those countries. But one statistic that I saw that was kind of eye-catching was the amount of negative opinion or suspicion of China in Uzbekistan rose from 5% to 64%, higher than Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So I just want to know, why do you think that happened, and what do you think are the main causes of that? Thank you.
Hi, Abhi Goyal, formerly of the Central Asia nonprofit space. My impression is that Chinese public engagement in Central Asia is actually shockingly light touch. I know you were talking about the behind the scenes approach for commercial projects, but why is public facing diplomacy so insular? Why is it so small scale? Are they afraid of backlash? Because in many cases, I see that it's very paltry compared to even Turkey, Iran, Saudi, etc.
Great, thank you. Zoe.
My question is with regard to critical minerals. So the Trump administration put critical mineral as the one of the most critical item on the agenda of engaging with the Central Asian economies. Do all the Central Asian 5 economies have a shared interest on this issue? And are they also viewing themselves as potentially an alternative to China's dominance in critical minerals? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dinara. I'm a grad student here in Colombia, and I'm from Kazakhstan. My question is also about critical minerals. Given that China is a global leader in the critical mineral space, and given that C5+1 heavily focuses on critical minerals to diversify away from China, what do you think about the scenario, how both countries and Central Asia can find the balance there? Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm a visitor from The Ohio State University. My question was a follow-up on the regime type question asked earlier. We know that there's varying types of leadership across these Central Asian countries. Did you find a relationship in the data between regime type of a country and the feelings or the sentiment among the population towards China?
Hi, my name is Alvaro. Thank you, Bradley and Edward, for being here. Much appreciated. My question is related to the data you used during the slides. Most of it, I believe is from the Central Asia Barometer. As an institution that in 2024, I believe, decided to suspend its work for a bit. Is there any type of other, if we're interested in the region, is there any other type of data you would recommend for us to use, or is that the main one or only one, and that's with the one we should go? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Those are great questions. So,
That's good.
yeah,
Okay,
don't feel like, please don't
Gonna do my
answer them
best.
all, but you do have a co-author.
On that latter question, I mean, there's nothing quite as extensive as Central Asia Barometer. Unfortunately, they decided to close for various reasons, and I think one of them was the pressure they were coming under, and other researchers were because of the nature of the research they were doing. You know, Pew and Gallup and others kind of collect data on the region. They were often actually doing that through Central Asia Barometer, and there's no one really that I've seen that have gone into those shoes. So it's, of course, a great loss for the community. In terms of different countries, yes, I think, you know, we maybe didn't reflect that enough in our presentation. Certainly, of course, the protest data points to protests in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. That's in part because protests are tolerated there. Turkmenistan is one of the most closed countries in the world. Tajikistan is similar. I think Uzbekistan is the interesting one, and that shift's really happened kind of after we did the bulk of our field work in kind of 2022, 2023, and that shift has come subsequently, and it's been very dramatic. You know, there's, if you've followed the work of Frank Maricione, who just got his PhD, his whole field work was in Uzbekistan during that period, and he's focuses on China's role. And so, you know, I'd look to his research that he's just started to publish to show kind of why that change has taken place. But it's definitely very the most dramatic swing in public opinion on China in the region in recent years.
Yeah, I would follow up with just noting agree that the loss of Central Asia Barometer is unfortunate because it was a rich source for public opinion polling. Of course, there are other types of data set. I'd have to plug our own website, Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. There's a lot of data sites, including our protest map, which you can look through thousands of protest incidents data to look at where they're occurring, what type of issues are mobilizing people, among other projects that we've been tracking. You can also break down the arms data and things like that, and you can see what type of arms are being transferred. As for questions like critical minerals, for example, I think that it's become a useful branding mechanism for the region. I think they're all invested because they understand it's something that Trump is personally interested in, and that by talking about it, they can get seats at the table with Trump that they may not otherwise have. And so I think it's become a useful branding exercise. But in terms of Central Asia's deposits, the role in actually getting them out the ground, I'm not sure that it would be a big game changer for the United States. Also, the fact that the vast majority of critical minerals, over 92%, are actually refined in China. And it's the refinement process that we're struggling to compete with, not so much even the supply side. And that's before getting into issues with Central Asia is very fragile, old-fashioned energy grids and so on. This is a very energy-intensive exercise mining, it would disrupt a lot of the grid, which has caused a lot of protests across the region, energy shortages in the middle of winter. These are just issues that the states would be dealing with. So critical minerals, I think it's a very good branding exercise, but I'm skeptical of the practical realities of it being a game changer anytime soon.
Second, on critical minerals, I think that China has been more forward-thinking than we have about the critical minerals in Central Asia. They've been making investments, and they don't have absolutely everything they need. For example, to make gallium, which is needed in defense production, you need bauxite, and China has to import most of its bauxite, trying to make a deal for that in Central Asia. And so I think that we need to be mindful that China was there ahead of us, and Central Asians are also looking at Europe. They're looking at India. They're looking at Korea, Japan for these critical mineral deals. And so I think potentially Central Asia is in a good position if they don't agree too quickly to a lot of deals with China. If they agree too quickly, then they lose their leverage in this game. And another space to watch is Russia and China on critical minerals, because China's not sharing its technology with Russia in that area.
Okay, well, we're wrapping up, closing. Thanks to the panel. We have 4 Central Asia experts up here, and there aren't enough Central Asia experts. It's a big, important region, and we had a short time to talk about it, and the more questions we ask, the more curious we get, and the more there is to know. So thanks to Alex for chairing, and for Ed and Bradley for their expertise, and Liz for your expertise, and thanks to the audience for very good questions. Thank you.